Good afternoon, everyone. I know you've had a very stimulating series of discussions and speakers this morning. I'll try to keep up my end of the bargain, and certainly following that great introduction from Jonathan, I feel motivated to do a good job for all of you. I know you're having lunch. I want to make clear, as someone who grew up in an Italian-American household, you're allowed to make noise and eat. We're used to that and having conversations while that's happening. So I won't be offended. Don't be polite. Just keep going. I also want to take a moment to salute Jonathan for his leadership on behalf of Pattern for Progress and really the entire team, the great work that you do month after month on behalf of this region, very important region in our state, so great work that you do for all of us in New York. And certainly this conference and this discussion is timely, and it doesn't happen without a great deal of effort. So to everyone on the Pattern team, thank you for what you do to keep a focus on the important issues that affect this region and affect all of us in New York State. And I know you had some great colleagues in government speaking this morning, Congressman Maloney and DOT Commissioner McDonald, two very smart and capable people. I also want to point out some of my staff who are here, just so you should know in terms of follow-up. Grizel Davis, who's our regional rep for the Hudson Valley area, is right there. So any of you that have any intergovernmental or community affairs questions, Grizel is the person. And standing in the back is Gabe Deo, who's our Deputy Comptroller for Local Government and School District Accountability. So his team was very much involved in developing the report that Jonathan referred to, and Jonathan mentioned the audits. So if you want to give compliments to the audit team, they report to Gabe. If you have criticisms, it's not my fault. Talk to Gabe. You know, it's. But seriously, Gabe is based obviously in our office in the Capitol, but we have regional offices all across the state, including in Newburgh, and Gabe is the one who's in charge of our audit team across New York. So again, just so you get to know some of the people involved with our operation, these are two people that you should know. I do want to also, Jonathan was mentioning to me that Pattern is celebrating its 50th anniversary, and that's great because Pattern, as I said, is a great and important asset for the Hudson Valley, an example really for all in New York about how to build partnerships. When we talk about sustainability, when we talk about successful communities, we do need to bring together the stakeholders all across the board, the local government officials, the business people, those in academia, certainly the not-for-profit sector, labor, and so on. And Pattern has done that. And the ways in which you do it to analyze major policy issues, come up with thoughtful reports and recommendations that thought leaders can respond to and policymakers can react to. It really is a very, very commendable record of achievement that you have. And today's focus in this event on infrastructure investment is another example of the great efforts that you've been involved with for a very, very long time. So I'll state the obvious, and you all know it already. We need to work together to create the vibrant economic environment that will spur more jobs to be created in stronger communities here in the Hudson Valley and all across New York State. And that's, again, where it gets back to discussions such as you're hosting today, communication, collaboration, policy analysis, sharing information. When it comes to infrastructure, I know many of you have been advocates on the front line in this regard. I'd like to think in terms of the Albany perspective, the Comptroller's office has also been viewed as one of the loudest voices to say that we need to do a better job of focusing on infrastructure if we really are going to achieve that economic strength that we all strive for. The solutions to our current infrastructure challenges are absolutely critical to our economic well-being. So with that as a context, as a lead into my thoughts on your topic, I think it's appropriate to just do a quick update as to where we're at with our economy in our state and beyond. Certainly our national economy continues to be in the 6th year of recovery. We can certainly see that New York State is expanding and improving as well. The unemployment rate for the state in March was down to 5.8%, certainly well down from the recessionary high of 9.6% back in January of 2010. Here in the Hudson Valley region, unemployment rate was even a little better, 4.8%. So we're very pleased that over the past 5 years or so, our state has added over 620,000 private sector jobs. And that's certainly very, very good news and welcome news. The challenge, though, is a very obvious one. New York is a large and diverse state, and that job regrowth has certainly been uneven. In fact, about 81% of those jobs that have been recreated since 2009 have been recreated in the 5 boroughs of New York City and Nassau and Suffolk County out on Long Island. In fact, New York City alone accounts for about 430,000 of those new private sector jobs. Here in the Hudson Valley region, you see diversity as well. Some counties are doing better than others. The region has added about 22,000 jobs since 2009. Most of this growth has occurred in Orange, Rockland, and Westchester counties. Dutchess, Putnam, Ulster, and Sullivan counties either saw relatively modest growth or in some communities actually continue to lose jobs. It's a similar picture to what we see when we look all across upstate New York. City regions such as Utica, Binghamton, Elmira have continued to lose jobs even after the recession has ended. Obviously, some of that had to do with longstanding economic trends and challenges, certainly made worse by the economic downturn. And while we continue to see that positive net job growth private sector-wise statewide, we certainly have been losing public sector jobs, about 72,000 over the past few years. I know with the school budget votes coming up and a better year in terms of school aid and pension costs going down, some districts are starting to add staff again, but you certainly have seen on the local government and school district side contraction as far as those jobs. Sales tax collections, another important indicator of where our economy is at. We just put out a sales tax report, as we do on a regular basis. You know, positive news in that sales tax collections grew 2013 to 2014 by 3%, over $430 million. Not such good news is that the year before, 2012 to 2013, sales tax growth was over 5%. Here in the Mid-Hudson region, sales tax collections grew also by 3%, 13 to 14, less than the 4.2% growth the year before. We look at sales tax growth because sales tax is a very important source of revenue at the local government level. Certainly for state government, it's also one of the big revenue sources. Does this mean that there's weakening confidence on the consumer side? Is this going to be a long-term trend that we're going to see through 2015? We don't know the answer to that, but it is important that, you know, we continue to look at that as an economic indicator. You know, so I think overall the state's in much better shape, but we see tremendous regional differences, and that is something we always have to keep in mind. It's very, very clear, though, the main point is that while we are in a recovery mode, we really do need to do more to make sure that that recovery will be turned into a sustained and strong period of economic growth. And if we're serious about building a strong economic future here in the Mid-Hudson Valley and across our state, strong infrastructure certainly needs to be a non-negotiable ingredient into that thought process. The report that Pattern for Progress has just released, following on the one issued in May of 2014, I think represents a very important contribution to this discussion. As I've certainly said, as our office has pointed out in our reports, and as your reports make clear, if we are going to attract new jobs and businesses and create healthy, livable communities, we need an infrastructure that's up to the challenge. Safe, modern roads, rail lines and bridges, upgraded wastewater and drinking water systems. There's no doubt, and I know you know this better than I do, our work is cut out for us on this front. Very simply put, right now too much of our state's infrastructure is deteriorating. Now, a lot of focus obviously has been on the Tappan Zee Bridge, and that's appropriate. That is a big infrastructure project, one that had been put on the low burner for too long, and I give the governor credit for keeping it on the front burner. Obviously, that replacement is well underway, and that's certainly welcome news. And while it is the state's biggest infrastructure project currently in progress, there are scores of other roads and bridges across the Hudson Valley, throughout New York, that are also in need of attention, and attention right now. According to the U.S. Department of Transportation data, more than 1/3 of New York's highways and the bridges over those highways that are maintained by local governments are structurally deficient or functionally obsolete. I'm sure you've seen the same data and the same reports. That data also suggests very strongly that the number in that category will rise substantially over the next 10 years. Now, we've undertaken several audits of bridge maintenance by the State Department of Transportation and the major public authorities that have responsibility in this area. Our 2013 audit of DOT's Railroad Bridge Inspection Program, which actually was cited in your report, thank you for mentioning it, is one that I think made clear that this is an area that needs to get more of a focus. We did a 2012 audit that reviewed the Thruway Authority's inspection of its bridges. We found some issues there as well. Those issues included red flag conditions, meaning critical structural components that require prompt evaluation and corrective action, where the Thruway Authority could not document that it had taken the steps to remove immediate hazards before final repairs could be made. We made several recommendations as to how the Thruway Authority could improve its work in this area. We did a follow-up audit in 2014, and the good news was on this audit, we found that the authority had largely implemented and agreed with our recommendations. Our roads and our highways also need work in addition to our bridges. According to the Federal Highway Administration, over 1/4 of road and highway miles in New York State were in unacceptable condition in 2012. Our wastewater infrastructure faces similar challenges. Our audits of local government water systems have found significant water losses attributed in part to water main breaks, minor leaks, and malfunctioning water meters. These losses result in wasted chemical treatment costs, lost revenues, higher water rates for customers. A 2008 study by the Department of Environmental Conservation concluded that 30% of the state's 22,000 miles of sewer lines were beyond their expected useful life. That DEC report also concluded that 23% of wastewater facilities in New York are operating beyond their useful life expectancy, and many more are outdated or have an inadequate technology. This increases the likelihood of untreated sewage, such as the recently discovered 2013 spill in the city of Amsterdam's treatment works, which threatened contamination of their drinking water supply. These are all examples of why, if we don't address infrastructure in the long run, the costs become even more daunting. And while our infrastructure challenges continue to grow, the reality is state and local spending just has not been keeping pace with the need. As Jonathan mentioned, we released our latest report in September, Growing Cracks of the Foundation, that looked at recent local government capital spending on roads, bridges, water, and sewer systems. We found that over the past several years, New York's local government spending to maintain and improve these systems had actually decreased. Specifically, annual local government capital spending on roads and bridges in 2012 was $49 million less than in the year 2010. And combined water and sewer capital spending in 2012 was $69 million less than was spent in 2010. It's almost a 20% decline. In 2012, New York local government's capital spending totaled $1.2 billion for these systems. That's less than 1/3 of the $3.9 billion annually that many experts believe is required to support local infrastructure needs. Now, I know a number of you in the room are local government officials, and it's no mystery why local governments are struggling to address their capital needs. Many local governments are dealing with an unprecedented mix of fiscal and budget challenges, including decreased state and federal funding, a loss of jobs, declining property values, population loss in many cases, increasing costs that they have no control over, and then, of course, the new budget reality for the past few years in New York is living with the tax cap and now the tax freeze and the impact that that has on local budgeting strategies. As you know, the tax cap generally limits increases in local government and school district spending in terms of tax levies to the lesser of 2% or the rate of inflation. The tax cap law allows local governments to levy an additional amount for certain excludable expenditures. But while the school districts are allowed to exclude capital spending from the tax cap limitations, this exemption does not apply to local governments. The majority of local governments are working to remain within the tax cap by limiting their tax increases. Our annual report on local governments found that overall, local government revenues increased by just 1.9% in 2012, 1.4% in 2013, essentially keeping pace with inflation, while local government expenditures were largely held flat. And as costs continue to rise, many local officials continue to make difficult budget choices. Our report notes that many local governments have cut programs and staff, diminished rainy day funds, deferred maintenance and capital purchases, or cut public services. For example, between 2009 and 2013, counties reduced health service expenditures by $370 million statewide. Cities cut transportation spending by $33 million. Towns cut garbage collection by over $79 million. With all these competing pressures and demands, it's no surprise that infrastructure would be underfunded by localities. But clearly, we need to do a better job. As Pattern's 2014 report pointed out, one important step would be for municipalities to engage in capital improvement planning. More than half of the municipalities that responded to the Pattern survey said they did not do so. It's understandable that local officials, especially in our smaller communities, find it hard to devote time and resources to such planning. But effective capital planning is essential at the local level, at the state level as well. Our Division of Local Government and School District Accountability, and I mentioned Gabe is the head of that division, provides extensive assistance in this area for local governments. We do much through the web, as everybody does these days. That includes online tutorials, management guides, and other tools that are readily available. Municipal and school officials can benefit from the specific guidance that we can offer on developing a capital plan and financing implications. So certainly for those of you who are in local government, perhaps in a community that's dealing with this issue, I really would urge you to reach out to my office, reach out to our staff. If you're not familiar with these resources and tools that we can provide, I think we could be helpful to you as you deal with that issue. Well, you know, I'm sure you've been talking this morning about the challenge to our infrastructure with what's been happening with the weather events that we've been going through. Certainly we've seen our share of damaging weather. Tropical Storm Lee and Irene, Superstorm Sandy certainly had a tremendous impact on our state. We still have many communities that are rebuilding still. In the wake of what really was billions of dollars of damage inflicted on our communities by those storms, the massive costs of repairing and reconstructing infrastructure systems damaged by these natural disasters and other unexpected events usually are not budgeted for at the municipal level, certainly. Local governments have had to adjust their repair and maintenance budgets and fund costs to handle some level of remediation. Now, while certainly the federal government has been a key partner in this regard, providing substantial assistance, the funding does not cover all weather-related damage. Aged water, sewer, and transportation infrastructure are especially at risk in cases of massive flooding and other severe weather events. And with climate change, we can expect that the frequency and severity of these kinds of weather events will continue to grow in the future. While severe storms pose the most obvious risk to our infrastructure, even a harsh winter season like the one that just passed can put our water, sewer, and transportation systems to the test. Intense freezing and thawing can contribute to water main breaks, cracking roads and bridges, and potholes, all of which require additional repair and maintenance costs. I don't envy those of you at the town and village, city and county level with what we went through on this past winter. With the reality of limited local revenues and more frequent and damaging storms on the horizon, the real question is, and what you're grappling with today, is how do we adequately address our looming infrastructure needs at both the state level and the local level. Now, credit to where credit is due. Over the past couple of years, the governor and the legislature have taken steps to better coordinate and prioritize state capital construction and infrastructure projects with the creation of the New York Works Task Force. The purpose of the task force is similar to the Capital Asset and Infrastructure Council that I had proposed a couple of years ago in our Fiscal Reform Act. In that proposal, and certainly in our reports on planning and financing New York's capital investments, we continue to make a number of recommendations that I believe would significantly improve the way we address our long-term infrastructure challenges. From my point of view, first of all, we need to put together a longer vision for our infrastructure planning. I would suggest a 20-year planning horizon, and do a better job of prioritizing planning and then obviously locating the resources to execute that plan before we end up in a crisis mode. Some may argue we're in crisis mode already. One of our challenges at the state level is that we've used debt in the past too often for non-capital purposes, and that's left us with a limited capacity for future borrowing under our statutory debt cap. And that certainly adds to the challenge of finding the resources to address our massive infrastructure needs. The Division of Budget at the state level recently reported that available statutory debt capacity would decline to only about $776 million in just 3 years, and this margin could get even tighter. The recently adopted state budget added over $2 billion in new debt authorizations, which were not incorporated in those initial projections. The state has also, from my point of view, made some questionable choices regarding the use of available infrastructure funds. For example, some of you may have read, we put out a report on the dedicated Highway and Bridge Trust Fund. We spotlighted on how New York has used the fund to pay for non-capital items, such as snow and ice removal, state agency staffing at DOT and at motor vehicles. We need a smarter approach, and we need to give citizens the assurance that when we say there's a dedicated funding stream for these kinds of expenses, that in fact the money is going where it was intended. It seems to me our capital investments must be made through a more transparent and accountable process than we've had in the past. And I have been a strong advocate that we rely less on the kind of backdoor borrowing that we've done through public authorities so often, and get back to more accountability that comes with the involvement of the voters in general obligation debt. That's for another long address, but it is part of the picture, I think, of how we can be more strategic in dedicating resources to deal with this need. We have to have ongoing assessments of the state's own capital needs, as well as those elements of local government capital infrastructure where the state makes a significant contribution. Certainly in terms of your local highway projects, the state is a very, very key player. The state must create a capital planning process with comprehensive, long and short-term capital planning milestones that continuously identify specific needs for investments and shapes multi-year funding priorities to meet those needs. This year's budget was yet another example of our need to be more accountable and transparent when it comes to infrastructure spending. As you know, over the past 14 months or so, you've been reading a lot about the settlement money that's been coming into the state. With what's been received and what will be coming in the near term, you're talking about $7 billion, it's estimated, from an extraordinary string of financial settlements, primarily with banks and companies that violated federal and state banking laws. Throughout this year's budget process, I advocated, others advocated, for the majority of this one-time windfall to go towards essential capital investments or other one-time purposes. The enacted budget makes some of these funds available for infrastructure projects, certainly most significantly including the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement. The new budget created what's called a dedicated infrastructure investment fund and authorized up to $4.5 billion of the settlement money to be transferred to the new fund. The Budget Division has indicated an intent to use the money deposited to that fund for one-time purposes, as we've been advocating and would be appropriate. However, when you read the fine print of the wording, there's a certain amount of flexibility that under particular circumstances is built into the allocations, allowing the money to be moved for different purposes, including for ongoing expenses. There are still important questions as well that need to be answered regarding financing, certainly for the Tappan Zee Bridge replacement, but really overall for the Thruway Authority as we move forward. The bottom line is certainly for the Tappan Zee Bridge, it's an extraordinarily important link for our economy, not only for the downstate region, but for all of our state. Particularly has a big impact for you in the Hudson Valley. A sound, transparent financing plan is essential to give the public, rating agencies, bond investors greater confidence in the Thruway's management of its finances and, the big question always, impact on tolls. Back in 2013, when the Thruway proposed a significant toll increase for certain truckers, I called on the authority to reduce costs and consider all other options before imposing a toll increase. And I was pleased the Thruway took a look at its operating expenses and held off on those proposed toll increases. And the Thruway deserves credit for making strides to reduce operational costs. In spite of progress in this area, in its December 2014 official statement, the Thruway Authority projected that toll or other revenues must increase by more than $30 million in 2015 and by more than $400 million by 2019. Thruway users deserve to know the full details of how the Thruway intends to generate and use any additional revenues as soon as possible before the cost of riding on the Thruway and using it goes still higher. We're keeping close attention on that one. You need to as well. Now, given New York's significant support for local government infrastructure, the state also has an important role to play in promoting more robust, long-term local infrastructure planning. One useful step would be for agencies such as DOT and the Department of Health and DEC to update previous studies on infrastructure and capital investment needs for localities across New York. Local officials should also identify both their long-term and short-term infrastructure needs and work in coordination with state agencies to adopt comprehensive capital plans and commit to the funding of them. Another key to addressing our infrastructure needs is making sure we're fully using available federal and state grant funding. State and federal agencies have grant programs and other services, as you well know, that can assist local governments with infrastructure improvement projects and planning. Local governments need to seek out wherever they can, and I know it's tough in this environment, and certainly we could use more help in this regard from Washington, but there are opportunities there. You need to be aggressive in seeking those opportunities out, collaborate with your federal and state representatives in that regard, and certainly when you're looking for those grants, making sure that you have a very clear, well-thought-out capital planning process is a very key ingredient in a competitive grant environment. Now, there's also been a lot of talk when we talk about infrastructure about public-private partnerships, about P3s, as another option, perhaps an innovative financing solution for some of our infrastructure needs. From my point of view, P3s may be an effective tool, but only if used properly. They can provide us with new options for planning, financing, and building essential infrastructure, but this should not come at the expense of cost-effectiveness, transparency, and accountability. Whether we're talking about tax dollars, tolls, fees, or other charges, it's critical that public resources be used in the most economic, efficient, and accountable way possible. We always need to keep in mind that no matter how we structure the financing, it's the public who ultimately bears the costs, and the businesses as well that would use, in the case of a toll road, that would use a toll road that may be financed by a P3 agreement. So it's very certain in my mind that if we're going to go down that road, we need a clear understanding up front of potential benefits and costs of any P3 project. We put out a report, it's available on our website, that offered concerns and also offered recommendations on how we should move forward if we're going to consider the use of P3s in New York State. One clear area of concern is that private debt and other payments associated with P3s could be costly and could tie us into long-term agreements that will impact the public for decades to come. We've seen the experience in other states where poorly drafted agreements have been expensive and very difficult to correct once they've been signed. To protect taxpayers, my office has recommended that any P3 expansion include strong transparency and accountability measures. These should certainly include statutory provisions that establish detailed procedures for the consideration of P3s, which would require evaluation of the costs and benefits, ensure a competitive procurement process is used to establish a level and open playing field among prospective vendors. Again, from my point of view, P3s can be an effective approach, but we need to do it the right way. We need to look at the experience in other states where it hasn't always worked out so well. So to sum it all up, our state is getting stronger, but we have a lot of work to do if we're going to turn this current recovery into sustained economic growth. It's more important than ever to target our state's resources and attention to areas that will help create jobs and serve as an economic catalyst for our economy. There's no doubt in that regard that a safe, modern infrastructure is essential to a vibrant, prosperous future. It's very, very clear when it comes to infrastructure or any other pressing concern for our local communities, it's never been more essential for government, business, labor, the nonprofit sector to communicate and to collaborate. And that's why, now more than ever, as I said at the outset, the work of Pattern for Progress in partnership with those of us in government is absolutely critical. Your proactive, and I might say at times, and I say this in a complimentary way, provocative agenda is very important to recognizing the challenges we face in finding long-term answers. And I have no doubt if we keep those lines of communication open with you, and Jonathan makes sure that we keep those lines open, and I appreciate that, and if we listen to your suggestions, learn from your experiences here in the Hudson Valley, we could certainly build a stronger region for you who live and work in this beautiful part of our state, and we can learn in ways that could help us all across New York State. So certainly, rest assured that we will continue to stay focused on these issues as you are. We follow your work and your thoughts, and we look forward to continuing to work with you to find the kind of solutions that we're all reaching for. So thank you so much for your kind attention, and I think we got time for questions. I hope we do. You know, there was some initial movement. I guess I would say there was a mandate relief task force that the governor set up early in his first term. That was changed to a permanent mandate relief council. I think it would be fair to say, from the perspective of local government officials, there is a sense that not much came out of that process. The biggest mandate relief where there has been movement, which doesn't affect your level directly, but it has to do with the states continuing to pick up more and more of the cost of Medicaid. So for those at the county level, that's probably been the biggest area of what would be considered mandate relief. Some at the county level argued that even more should be picked up at an accelerated schedule. But I think it would be fair to say that mandate relief is one of those issues that comes up all the time and tends not to have resolution. Partially for, I think, the reason that you touched on is that depending on how you define it, different people view different things as, you know, a mandate versus something that might be, you know, a very important requirement that government should provide, and there should be some standard, you know, across the board. Some areas of mandate relief that some officials point to are really labor law changes, you know, which get into a whole different, you know, conversation and discussion. You know, what I would say, and I always use the, you know, it's a simple example, but it, you know, I think it typifies what sometimes happens, you know, with the legislature. So when I was in the legislature, I sat in back of a colleague who was very passionate about, you know, there've been too many instances of kids at sporting events that, you know, got hurt and you know, died because there weren't defibrillators available. So, you know, he proposed that it be mandated at, you know, at schools to have it at sporting events, which happens now. And in fact, there was just an article in the paper down in my community on Long Island where someone was saved from that. You know, but the question was, but you're mandating that. Who's going to pay for it? You're not, the state's not paying. And this is minor in the context of cost compared to other mandates, I'm sure. But it gets to the philosophical question that often the legislatures face. So here's something that is arguably a health and safety issue that in fact may save a life. Do you not pass that because the state doesn't have the money to pay for all the defibrillators? Well, you know, and that is an example of how some of those mandates then get added and get you know, and happen. And I don't recall there were a lot of people that argued against it, even at the grassroots level, because they said, well, gee, probably it is something we should do. It would be a best practice. You know, here's my advice. I don't think as a local official you should, and you know, through your respective associations, I guess NICOM in your place, or in your case, and those of you with the towns, you have the Association of Towns and Association of Counties, School Board Association. You know, you should continue to make the point about mandate relief and continue to point to specific areas where you would certainly like to see the help. My other suggestion, though, is that as the state has been in a better budget condition, and you've seen an increase in funding for a number of programs, obviously a very significant increase as far as K through 12, pre-K through 12 education, you know, this year. You know, one area that has stayed flat has been the AIM funding, which is, you compare, the AIM funding is what goes to our cities, particularly across the state. It's like $715 million, and villages get some AIM funding. It's a really small amount of money relative to, you know, the what is it, 24 billion or so that we spend on K through 12 education, and it's been flat for a number of years. You know, if the state has more money to spend on other programs, the notion of increasing what is basically revenue sharing, remember the old revenue sharing concept where, you know, it was at the federal level where it was said that the federal government has access to more revenue than local government, so because of all the federal requirements, just gives, you know, extends some money and support to help with the basics of day-to-day governance that will help relieve some of the burden of the requirements and the mandates. I would suggest to you, again, it's not my role to tell the legislature and the governor how to spend the money. I just got to make sure they spend it right once they set out their priorities. But it would always seem to me that AIM funding, more money that's basically unrestricted aid to help you, would be another strategy that I think would be worthy of a little more attention. When I go to a lot of the association meetings, everybody's quick to say, well, too many mandates, but not enough saying, you know, the state's got more money, you're increasing funding for a lot of programs, especially if you're not going to relieve us on the mandate side, maybe a little bit more of the revenue sharing and an increase there, that could start to make a difference as well. So I hope some of that helps grapple with that issue.